country smaller than New Jersey, no oil, no nuclear arsenal pointed at America, and yet it receives more US foreign aid than any nation in the entire history of US foreign policy. And when 60% of Americans said they wanted that to change, nothing happened. No vote, and nobody in power offered an explanation for why. That's not democracy underperforming, that's something else running perfectly. I am Felix, and by the end of this video I'll show you exactly what that something else is, and why you were never supposed to see the full picture. Let's start with the foundation, because until you see the scale of this, nothing else lands properly. Since 1951, the United States has given Israel more than $317 billion in inflation-adjusted foreign assistance, the single largest foreign aid commitment in American history. And it isn't a response to recent conflict. It spans 70 years, 12 presidents, and every change of political power Washington has seen, without a single interruption. Since the year 2000, more than 86% of that annual figure has been military aid, not schools or hospitals, weapon systems, equipment, and defense financing, year after year. Here's what makes that genuinely strange. Foreign aid is one of the most politically toxic topics in Washington. Politicians build entire careers on promising to cut it. Voters say they want it gone. And this program, the largest in history, he passes every single year with no serious floor debate and no expiry date. Someone is holding that door shut, and it isn't the voters. Felix has been pulling on this thread for a while, and what's underneath isn't one answer, it's a structure, and structures don't change with elections. For 60 years, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, operated through traditional lobbying, congressional meetings, an annual conference that drew more elected officials than almost any event, influential. But it didn't spend directly on elections. In 2021, that changed, and the consequences were immediate. AIPAC formed a super PAC and began spending directly on congressional races. By the 2024 cycle, it and its affiliates had deployed over $45 million, reaching into more than 80% of all political races across the country. When two sitting congresswomen, both vocal critics of unconditional military aid, came up for re-election, AIPAC backed their opponents with a combined $29 million. Both incumbents lost, in two of the most expensive political primary races in American history. A former AIPAC official once placed a napkin on a table and said, "In 24 hours, we could have the signatures of 70 senators on this. That's not lobbying, that's a scoreboard. And what happens to the people who ignore it should tell you everything about why this policy never moves. Imagine you've just been elected to Congress. First week, a senior colleague walks you through the unwritten rules, the ones that don't appear in any handbook. And somewhere in that conversation, almost as a footnote, they mention that the last person who voted the wrong way on Israel funding lost their primary to a candidate nobody had heard of, backed by $20 million from outside their own district. No threat is made. None is needed. You don't require a phone call the next time that vote comes up. You already know the arithmetic. And here's the part Felix finds most telling. You'll never be asked directly. The system doesn't need to ask. It already showed you the answer before you even knew there was a question. That's how structural power operates at its most effective. Not through pressure applied in the moment, through consequences demonstrated in advance. So the pressure never needs to be applied at all. And here's where the tension in this story tightens. Because while that machine was being perfected, public opinion was moving in exactly the opposite direction. And the gap between those two things has been growing ever since. By August 2025, 60% of all American voters opposed sending more military aid to Israel, 75% of Democrats, 59% of independents. Among Americans aged 18 to 34, only 9% approved of Israel's military conduct in Gaza, a generational shift that should force an urgent political response. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs has tracked American attitudes toward Israel since 1978. 0 binding restrictions passed in Congress. 0 conditions attached to a single aid package. Now sit with that for a moment, because when 60% of a population shifts on a policy, that policy is supposed to move, eventually. That's the basic promise of representative government. The fact that it hasn't here isn't a glitch, it's a signal. Something was built around this policy that is more durable than our election cycles and more resilient than polling data. But money in elections are only 2 layers. There's a third, and this third one doesn't operate in Washington at all. The United Nations Security Council is the closest thing the world has to a binding international legal authority. Its resolutions carry genuine legal weight, and each of the 5 permanent members holds a veto, the power to block any resolution on any subject at any time. The United States has exercised that veto 89 times since 1945. 51 of those times the country being protected was Israel. That's not a pattern, that's a policy. Those blocked resolutions included demands to halt settlement expansion in the West Bank, calls for Geneva Convention compliance, and multiple ceasefire proposals during the Gaza conflict. In several cases, the United States was the sole dissenting vote, every other Security Council member in favour, Washington alone blocking passage. The veto doesn't just stop criticism, it stops enforcement, It means the international legal framework that applies to every other nation on Earth has been systematically blocked from applying to this one, and that raises the question almost nobody in mainstream coverage is willing to ask directly, why does a country this small command a shield this large? These sorts of questions don't make the evening news. Felix is the channel for that. Subscribe, and you won't miss what's coming next. The reason for such a shield is where this whole picture finally comes into focus. Most explanations of this relationship stop at AIPAC, and Felix gets why. It's the most visible piece. But it's only the surface of something far more interlocking. Christians United for Israel, an evangelical Christian organisation, has over 7 million members, larger than AIPAC itself. Their support is theological, structurally embedded in the Republican coalition, and entirely independent of Jewish American political activity. That bloc would remain one of the most powerful political forces in America if AIPAC ceased to exist tonight. Then there's the piece that almost never gets mentioned. That aid money doesn't simply leave America. A large portion is contractually required to come straight back, spent on US-made weapons, which means some of Washington's most powerful defense contractors have a direct financial stake in that vote passing every single year. The foreign policy and the profit motive aren't separate conversations, they're the same transaction. And underneath all of it, the Memorandum of Understanding. $38 billion over 10 years, signed in 2016, no annual review. It sits entirely outside democratic accountability. It sits there sustaining itself while everything else in politics shifts around it. Felix will put it plainly, this isn't a single organisation you can pressure. It isn't a single politician you can vote out. It's a web of interests, each one individually justifiable and but immovable as a collective. Felix would be failing you if this stopped there, because the United States does get something real from this relationship, and that matters to the complete picture. Israel is America's most capable intelligence sharing partner in the Middle East. The cooperation runs deep: joint weapons development, real-time intelligence exchange, and cyber capabilities that successive administrations from both parties have regarded as genuinely valuable on their own terms. That's strategic. Logic isn't invented for political cover. It reflects a calculation about regional stability that serious analysts across the political spectrum have held for decades. And AIPAC, for all the influence documented here, operates legally. Every dollar it spends is disclosed. Every vote it targets is public record. The mechanism was never hidden. It just needed assembling into a picture someone would hand you plainly. The question Felix is raising isn't whether this relationship has logic. It does. The question is whether these groups are receiving the scrutiny that anything this influential deserves. That belongs to voters to decide. But you can only decide it if you can see it clearly. The longevity of all this is not an accident of history. It's the result of diplomacy, assembled over 70 years, too established to be taken down by a single election. The blueprints were never secret. Every piece of this was always visible. It just needed someone to put it together and hand it to you clearly. Now Felix hands it to you. Good Felix?